Good afternoon. If you look at popular accounts of Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain, you will often discover that they are thought to have been a failure, that he didn't stay and the whole campaign resulted in no meaningful change. I'm going to argue to you today that his campaigns were a resounding success and that they did indeed lead to very significant change in the societies of Iron Age Britain. But first, I want to ask you to try and imagine a world without maps. Now, I'm going to use a few maps as I go along, but the Romans didn't have maps as we understand them, and that's a very important part in understanding why Julius Caesar does come to Britain twice. The Romans thought of their world as something like a Super Bowl. And so in the middle, there is the world that they know, focused around the Mediterranean Sea, and beyond that, there is an outer ocean. And nobody really knew, at the time that Julius Caesar lived, just over 2,000 years ago, what lay in the outer ocean. And so Britain, although the name was known, was a place that few had really any knowledge of, and certainly no Roman had ever been there. And it's in this understanding of the world that we should understand Julius Caesar's campaigns. And we need to understand his world in the one that he lived. And that's in Rome, a very big city for its time, huge in relation to any other place in the world. And it's almost a super city now. Elsewhere, everything is much smaller in Italy, and across temperate Europe, people are still living mainly in villages and small farms, a few bigger places, towns. But the contrast between Rome and the political structures that existed in it 2,000 years ago are quite remarkable when you look across the piece. Now, Rome has a democracy of sorts. It's a democracy if you're very wealthy and if you're a man. Other than that, not so democratic. And each year, the Roman elite would elect two people to be the supreme leaders, their consuls. And the purpose of this is to ensure that no person becomes too powerful. And there's a lot of jockeying to get these positions. And Caesar is part of a power-sharing deal with two other men, Crassus and Pompey. And the dynamic between these three men is really at the heart of what drives Julius Caesar. Now, Crassus is a very distinguished general and politician. He's the wealthiest man in Rome. Pompey is also enormously wealthy, and he is the outstanding general of his era. He comes to prominence young through his military ability. And Caesar is the rising star. And they create a power-sharing deal that ensures that Pompey and Crassus get elected as consuls not once but twice, and similarly they ensure that Julius Caesar becomes consul. And the importance of this is not so much for the authority that they gain in the year that they're in office, but in the opportunities that it presents later to go out into the Roman world with an army, where they can seek fame and they can seek fortune. And people become amazingly rich and wealthy. And this has already happened with Pompey. Now, Pompey the Great styles himself on Alexander the Great. That's where the name comes from. And he self-consciously seeks to be the most successful Roman general that there has ever been. And to a large extent, he succeeds in this. And I'm going to unpick an image here to try and show you how this works. Now, this is a coin that's issued on behalf of Pompey in 56 BC. So this is the year before Julius Caesar comes to Britain. And on it, we've got the heads, but I want to concentrate on the tails. And we have 4 wreaths of different sorts and some other symbols. And I'm going to explain how this works, because if you imagine this as a coin the size of a modern pound coin that would have been in people's pockets this is how Pompey is communicating with an audience that can very often not read. Pompey is claiming to have conquered the known world, and he does it like this. He has fought in Spain, and he's achieved a great triumph. And when you achieve a triumph, you come back to Rome, and there's a massive street party where people see what you've done and laud your achievements. So he's triumphed in Europe, he's triumphed in Africa, and most spectacularly in Asia, where he gets to the Caspian and he's consciously trying to achieve what Alexander the Great did in getting to India. He also has conquered the pirates who are interrupting the supply of grain to the Roman world, so that little logo there is the end of a Roman ship, the stern and upholstery. And he has also been put in charge of the grain supply to Rome. So he has these wonderful achievements, both militarily and in the protection of Rome, to which he is entitled to wear a golden wreath to the theatre. And he is building a great theatre, the biggest of its kind ever, the first permanent monument in which he can celebrate his achievements and also display some of the great wealth that he has brought back, particularly from the East. And all of this is symbolised in the middle by the globe. Pompeius Magnus has conquered the known world. Enter Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar is a very good friend, and in fact he becomes the father-in-law of Pompey, but they are great rivals, and they constantly seek to outdo each other. Now I put on an image of another coin here of Julius Caesar, and it shows a typical representation of a defeated barbarian, and this is where the defeated person, in this case a Gaul, is shown sitting behind a kind of little mannequin of their weapons. So there is the armour, a shield, and in this case a trumpet that symbolises that it's a Gaul. And this is almost like an icon for Caesar's propaganda. And as well as hearing the line that Julius Caesar's invasions of Britain were failures, you will often hear that you can't believe a word he says, because he's a master politician and a spin doctor. Well, he is. But I think we can believe in broad outline what he says, because the story that we have today comes from his annual reports that are written to the Roman Senate. And they are accurate reports in the sense that he has to vouch for them, but also there are dozens and dozens of other Roman senators involved in this process. His generals will be Roman senators. And if he goes beyond the line, he will be called out. And we know that Caesar puts his best foot forward, but we also know that in his army in Britain, there is the brother of the famous senator Cicero, and his younger brother is sending him letters. And we know of other works that are written at this time. So we have people who will vouchsafe what Caesar says, and we also have, although in second hand, other sources. So in broad outline, I think we can accept that what Caesar said is true. And that's important for understanding what happens in Britain. So Caesar has become consul, and then the following year, in 58, he becomes what's known as a proconsul, and he has the authority of an army, and he is sent to govern two parts of the Roman world. And these are in northern Italy. And the map you can see, the modern map, shows the extent of the Roman Empire at about this time. You can see it's very much a Mediterranean world. Spain has been gathered through long and hard wars over centuries. And much of the East has only recently been acquired through Pompey's campaign. Caesar is sent to govern the provinces of northern Italy. But, by misfortune, the governor of the south of France dies. Metellus Celer dies, and his province is handed to Caesar. And this is the beginning of Caesar's battle for Gaul and his battle for Britain. And Rome has a very flexible attitude towards its allies and friends, much as we see in the modern world today. It's convenient to support people when it's convenient, and sometimes one has interests that it makes it inconvenient. Now, the people of central and southern France are the allies of Rome. They have been on the border of the Roman province, the south of France, which is created nearly 70 years earlier. And so there's constant interchange between the Gauls and the Romans. And something sets to change this, and this is the migration of the tribe from the Alpine area, the Helvetii, so roughly modern Switzerland, who want to migrate to the west of France. And in order to do so, they would have to cross the territory of Rome's allies. And potentially, this could destabilise the Roman province in the south of France. In reality, Caesar picks a fight. He picks a fight because he knows he can get rich, and he knows he can get wealthy. And nobody in Rome really bats an eyelid about this, because this is what Romans did. When Pompey almost got as far as the Caspian, there was no need for him to go there, but it was accepted as a good thing to conquer and to bring barbarian people under the influence of Rome. And so, for the next 8 years, almost a decade, the battle whirls across France. This image that looks like the opening credits from the TV series Dad's Army kind of captures the broad here, there, everywhere. And eventually, peace is brought. A settlement is reached. But in 55 BC, so having been fighting since 58, so 4 years into the campaign, Caesar does two remarkable things. He crosses the Rhine into Germany, and he crosses the sea to Britain. And in both places, no Roman has ever gone before. So he is setting a first there. And he does this very consciously and very quickly. And I believe that this is because he is seeking to make an impact. Now, I'm going to turn just in a moment to look at how we can see the evidence of Julius Caesar's invasions in Britain, but I just want to make a couple of points about what Roman forts look like. Now, in Britain, we're so familiar with places like Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall in Scotland that we think of Roman forts as playing card shaped. Well, at this stage in the 1st century BC, it's not like that. Roman forts can be square, rectangular, but very often they're very odd shapes. They use the contours. And here's a plan of a famous battle at the end of the war in France, at Alesia. And all the red lines are the Roman defences that encircle the Gaulish town, so they're siege works. But around it, there are small Roman forts. And up in the top right-hand corner, circled in green, what looks like an irregular enclosure. Scale there is a couple of 100 metres. For an archaeologist, you would say it looks like an Iron Age farm. But we know from the details at the entrance and the fact that there are sling bullets with the name Labienus, Caesar's number 2 in command, we know that this is a Roman fort. And we know that it dates precisely to 52 BC. And the point I want to take from this is that Roman forts don't always look like playing cards. But let's turn to Britain. Now, Caesar comes for a very short period, right at the end of the summer, at the end of the campaigning season. And this is one of the reasons why it's been argued that the campaign was a failure, because he didn't stay. He never intended to. They were always going back to France. Now, he comes literally at the end of August. And I've given a very modest number for the legions. The legions might have between 5,000 and 6,000 in their notional strength, but we have evidence that they can be down to 3,500. So let's say he just brings a force of maybe 6,000, 7,000. And the conventional interpretation is that he leaves from Boulogne and that he tries to land at Dover. Unable to do so, he coasts along for about 7 miles and lands somewhere at Deal. And this is the narrative you'll see in all the history books. Now, I don't agree with that. I think it's wrong, but I don't want to delay us with what might be thought of as the pedantry of dealing with Latin text. The argument that Caesar wanted to land at Dover is that he could only do so if there was an unopposed landing, and as soon as a landing is opposed, he chooses somewhere much more sensible to land. I think he always intends to land somewhere much more sensible, and in my own opinion, that's probably nearer Worth. In any event, Caesar returns within a month. And in Rome, they think this is a great success because he is awarded the biggest and longest public thanksgiving of public ceremonies ever recorded, 20 days of public thanksgiving. So when people say that Caesar's campaign was a failure, that's not what people thought in Rome. And as well as the British campaign, his crossing of the Rhine into Germany is counted in that as well. The following year is something different. This is an army with a different intention. He comes with 5 legions, 2,000 cavalry, and an amazing fleet of 800 vessels. This is an army that has come to tie Britain into the Roman world. The purpose of Caesar having made the first mission is that he has crossed beyond the sea. He's gone beyond the inhabited world. That's why he gets to public thanksgiving. He's done something that nobody's ever done before. What he comes back to do is to tie Britain into the Roman world. And there's quite a dramatic story to this because he leaves from a place where we're told it's Port Itissius. It's probably near Sangatte, just by Calais. And the intention is that they're going to take the fleet north using the tide and using the wind to sail across the channel, but at midnight the wind drops and they're carried too far. And at first light they see Britain a long way away on their left-hand side, and they land successfully. And displaying typical British sang-froid, they retire. No fire. They don't contest the landing. Now, where does this happen? Well, I think we can narrow it down quite precisely. And I want to say a little bit about the landing places before moving on to look at the rest of the campaign. This is the map of northeast Kent, and at the top we have the Isle of Thanet. And this is a LiDAR image which allows us, as the archaeologists, to manipulate the scanning to bring out the topography. And what you can see here is that the Isle of Thanet is high ground, then the former Wantsum Channel is very low-lying ground, and gradually the land rises up. Thanet was an island until the Middle Ages, but systematic reclamation of the land by the great religious orders of Canterbury ensured that by the 14th or 15th century, it's dryish land. And very soon, the ships that could once sail through the Wantsum Channel from the English Channel up to the Thames estuary can't do that. It becomes impassable. And so there's been very dramatic landscape change through natural reclamation, but also coastal processes. So the big, long mark you see on the coast, looking like just a dark line, is what's known as a Deal spit. That's a spit that's formed by longshore drift, and that's gradually blocked up the mouth of the Wantsum Channel as well. So much of the low-lying land 2,000 years ago wouldn't have been land. It would have been either wet or salt marsh. And it's into this landscape that we can place the modern settlements of Deal, where I think Caesar didn't land, near to Worth, where I think he probably did. Richborough is a traditional landing place for the Roman army under Claudius, almost 100 years later, and Ramsgate is the modern port, but I'm going to look at Pegwell Bay, and in particular a place called Ebbsfleet. And as Professor Lloyd said in the introduction, I've worked in commercial archaeology for many years, and with my colleagues in Oxford and Wessex Archaeology, we were working on a massive road scheme, huge project, 150 archaeologists, awful lot of things to do very quickly. And what you can see here is the southernmost part of the site, looking out towards the River Stour as it flows into the Wantsum Channel, Pegwell Bay, and beyond that is the channel itself. And we came across a very big ditch. It's not very exciting on its own, very big ditch. You can see it marked in one place there in red. and nearer to the bottom of the picture, there again. And these ditch, it's clearly the same feature, it looked the same, was 500 metres apart. And we had traces of it elsewhere from earlier work. And this puzzled me because we knew that the ditch dated to the 1st century BC. But at that time, it was very rare for people to build large defensive enclosures in Britain. Hill forts are well known, but generally they'd stopped to be built 100 years before. And also, this patently wasn't on a hill. So what was it doing there? And I kind of chewed away at this while we were on site, but there was a lot going on, an awful lot to do, and it was only as we came out of the field that I began to wonder. And my wondering works around the landscape, in the sense that this is a view from above the site at Ebbsfleet, taken with a drone just last year, and I just want to mark on a few topographic details. There's Ramsgate and the white cliffs that encircle the eastern side of Thanet. Pegwell Bay, which is the largest bay in East Kent, and then we have a couple of bits of dating evidence for the reclamation. So the green line shows roughly where a medieval seawall was built in the 12th or 13th century. We know that because it's referred to in a historical document. And probably the Iron Age shoreline is about where the red line is, it's about 500 metres. What that means is the sea is closer to the site. There's the road, now fully operational, in which we first could understand the site. I realised we needed to do more work, so with Colin Hazelgrove, my colleague at Leicester, who can't be here today, and my colleagues in Kent County Council, who've provided a wonderful group of volunteers to work, we've undertaken geophysical surveys, because in the road scheme we cannot go beyond the line of the road. With the geophysical surveys we can look more widely. And what this shows very simply is the big yellow line in the middle is the road. There's another line to the right of it which is a pipeline, and then the grey tone on the left is our geophysical surveys. And then marked in red is the line of the defensive ditch. And it's quite clear from looking at the topography that it continues, the ditch has to continue round a small hill. And the reason there's no grey tone in this area is because it's woodland and we can't survey there. What happens nearer to the shore, I'm really uncertain about. But it tells us that this defensive enclosure is of 1st century BC date, it's of at least 20 hectares in size, and it faces towards Pegwell Bay. And we have some similar finds elsewhere. And the shape of the ditch and the size of the ditch at Ebbsfleet is almost identical to the defences at Elysia. Now I showed you a picture, a plan of the Roman siege works there. And in the inset there is Roman legionary with the typical equipment, and they include the spear known as a pilum. And in our excavations, with one of here's Don, one of the volunteers from Kent, standing in the ditch, typically 5 metres wide, 2 metres deep. In it we found human bone and weapons and one small but very significant object. And it's barely 10 centimetres long, but it's the tip of a Roman pilum of Republican type. And here are some objects, again from Elysia, from the massive excavations in the 19th century. And our Ebbsfleet weapon is pretty much the same. And there are other examples from sites of this date in Germany and in Spain. So we have a Roman-style defence, and we have Roman weapons. Why should this be? Well, I think the answer to that is the defence is built to enclose a very large area. Elysia encircles a Gaulish town. And there are similar defences in siege works in modern Albania for the Battle of Diriachum. It's a style of defence that you build to enclose areas. It's not the defence that you would build for a fort. And most particularly, Caesar needs to build a defence to protect his fleet, because his fleet is damaged in a storm. And they decide to haul it out of the sea and to enclose all the ships, all 800 of them, in a single defence. And this fits almost perfectly with Julius Caesar's description. Now, I've said that in 54 BC, at first light, they realise they've been carried too far by the tide. And at sunrise, Caesar, he sights Britain left afar on the port side. And he gives us another clue by saying this is the best place of disembarkation, and Pegwell Bay is the biggest bay. And then at a separate point, he tells us that he leaves the fleet on a soft and open shore, and that's where it gets damaged by the storm. And if we put these things together and think of ourselves as sailors in a boat far at sea, you will know that you can't see low-lying ground. The curvature of the Earth's surface means that you can only see high ground. And the only high ground that Julius Caesar could have been seeing has to be the cliffs of Thanet. We have a mention of high ground later in the text where he says the Britons intend to fight and they see 800 ships and then they think better of it and they retreat to the high ground. And he leaves the fleet where he thinks it's safe on a soft and open shore, which is the best place of disembarkation. Pegwell Bay is the biggest bay in Kent. So I think we're able to show the first archaeological evidence for this is where Julius Caesar landed in 54 BC. But what else happens? Well, I'm going to move through the rest of the campaign very summarily, but at first light in 54 BC, Caesar marches to confront the Britons. He is planning to attack them before they can organise their resistance too well. And there is one battle, which is won, whereupon he gets the news that the fleet has been damaged in the storm, and they go back and they spend 10 days defending the ships and hauling them out of the shore. He then returns somewhere near Canterbury, and there is a second battle. Because there is no fleet, they have to march towards a crossing of the Thames, and it's there that he is aiming, because the reason that he is given for his landing in 54 BC is that a prince of the tribe Trinobantes, who we identify with the Roman tribe of later times of Essex, the Trinobantes, a prince of the Trinobantes had fled to Caesar asking for his protection because that prince, called Mandubracius, his father had been killed by a man called Cassivellaunus. And Caesar is intending to go and defeat the leader of the coalition, because Cassivellaunus is made overall warlord by the Britons. So Caesar is seeking out this particular individual and his army to destroy it. And he does that successfully. And he then concludes a peace. And for the Romans, that is mission accomplished. You don't need to occupy, you don't need to leave an army behind, you just need to assert your authority. And we can map some of the details of this campaign. I just want to touch on a few details here. Now, as well as excavation and LiDAR, we've done some very old-fashioned survey techniques, my colleague Alistair Oswald here. And that's allowed us to identify with confidence that the site that the first battle is fought at is a place called Bigbury, just outside Canterbury. And Caesar describes it rather formulaically, that it's well defended by nature and by man. And we've resurveyed this site very carefully, and we're happy that with new detail it fits with what Julius Caesar says. So that's the first battle. Where he crosses the Thames, I know not. I don't have an answer to that. But in Hertfordshire there are one or two finds that we can identify as groups of weaponry that seem to date to this period, and they could be evidence for skirmishes or battlefield deposits. But the final battle is fought near the territory of the Trinobantes, and we know that because Caesar says the Trinobantes give his army food, and he tells his army not to harm these people. And then they discover that the oppidum of Cassivellaunus, the defended place, is not far away. Now, not far away is a bit of an elastic definition, but it puts us somewhere near Essex. And Caesar describes very succinctly how they storm this fort of Cassivellaunus. And he uses pretty much the same description. It's well defended by nature and man, but he adds the detail that it's also protected by marsh, the Paludvisci. And you would have thought that some enterprising soul would already have looked at every hill fort in the southeast of England to see whether there either are marshes or there could have been marshes. But nobody had ever done it until now, and it narrows it down to 3 possibilities. And the only possibility that's in the right place is Walbury Camp, just south of Stansted Airport. And I'm afraid I can't get a particularly good image of the marshes, but this is a view looking east up across the marshes towards Walbury. It fits. So I think this is the place where the final defeat of Cassivellaunus' army, he's not there himself, the army is defeated and Cassivellaunus has to come to terms. What other things can we see that fit? Well, I've mentioned a little about weaponry, but also coins are issued to pay the soldiers. And these are coins that are issued in northern France, again about the size of a pound coin, and the dots indicate where they've been found. And the little diagram in the bottom left-hand corner shows how many dies are used to make these coins, because they're made by stamping a bit of metal between 2 dies. And things are going along quite normally at about 500 dies, and then there's a 3-fold increase to over 1,500, circled in red. And we correlate that massive increase in coinage with the Gallic Wars and its coinage to pay the soldiers. So we have evidence of hoards of coins in Britain and France, and also we have less dramatic evidence of tin coins, which are mainly found in Kent, but there is a group in London of hoards, half a dozen hoards, in places where we don't normally find such coins. And it's likely that these potin coins, as they're called, are taken by the British Army as they retreat in front of Caesar, and it points us towards where we might look for the crossing. But what of the aftermath? Because Caesar tells us how he sets the deal. He says that he takes hostages, the Opsides, and he also imposes tribute, an annual tribute that Britain will have to pay. So he's binding Britain into the Roman world by taking the family of the leaders, and these are usually the children and relatives of the leaders, back to Rome, and he's making sure they pay money. And we begin to see this reflected in the archaeological record. So in the area around Welwyn, we find a series of graves dating to the middle of the 1st century BC that suddenly appear, very rich burials, lots of objects in them. And here you see 5 wine amphora, but there are things like silver cups, and here's the silver cups from another grave at Welwyn, and there are graffiti on the bottom of these cups in Latin, so they've been owned by a Roman person before they're given to the people who then eventually put them in the grave. Now these are very, very unusual finds. If we look across France and Germany at this time, we don't find objects like this in graves. These look like diplomatic gifts given to the elite who chose the right side and backed Caesar. And we also see, quite dramatically, changes in the coinage. Now here's a typical British Iron Age coin. It's got a horse on one side and a very mixed up head. Once upon a time, that was the head of Apollo, but it's become something different now. And it's a very traditional style, but this coin is by a man called Tincomarus. And we assume that he is the son of a man called Commius, who flees Britain from Caesar. He's been with Caesar's, he's been on his side, he's been a Guinean, he's on his side, And eventually he says, I will go anywhere as long as I never have to see a Roman again. And we would assume that deal takes him to Britain, where we find the coins of Commius, and it also means his son, Tincomarus, is brought up in Rome. And as John Crichton has shown, all of a sudden, Tincomarus coins become Roman. They go from a British type to absolutely classical. And this is a coin, it could be a coin of Augustus. And the quarter coin, a bit like a 5p that goes with it, is even more remarkable. It's got the bust of Medusa on it. So at some point, Tincomarus stops being British and he starts acting Roman. And then when we look where these coins are found elsewhere, similar types of coins, we see that it's not just in Britain. And the interesting one here is the coin of Juba, whose father was the king of Numidia, and Juba becomes a hostage. He's taken back to Rome, where he serves with great distinction. He becomes an outstanding scholar, and then he is returned to Africa and installed as king. And what John Crichton argues is that what we see happening, and very well documented, in Africa is what happens in Britain. We see the hostages being returned. And then this helps us understand, when we look at the earliest towns in Britain, why we suddenly see organised urban planning and rectangular buildings. This is not typically British, but it emerges, and here's a detail from the site at Silchester near Reading. If we look at the range of imported Roman goods that occur in the last decade or so after the conquest, it increases massively. And this example is from Braffing, a small place in Hertfordshire, and there's the food of the Romans. There's oil, fish sauce, there's wine, there's a food preparation, the cooking kit, there's the eating and drinking vessels, but there's also things like jewellery, perfume bottles, and styling. There's a whole Roman material culture that tells us that within a generation or so after Caesar's campaigns, we are seeing Romans in Iron Age Britain. And if there was any doubt, evidence from graffiti, here's some material from Fishbourne, but we get names like Gracchus, the Greek, and that's probably a slave. So it's quite clear that in the decades after the Caesarean invasions, we see a very strong Romanization of Iron Age Britain. And this reaches its denouement in about 10 BC, where we see a grave at Colchester, a place called Lexden. And this is a tiny medallion of the Emperor Augustus. But in the grave of the dead person at Lexden, there are bits of Roman furniture, a sofa, a folding chair, statuary, lamps, huge range of imported wine, a Roman suit of armour. These are the things that a client king receives when they go to Rome to have their accession to the throne confirmed. And it's perhaps the clearest evidence we have that Britain has been tied in by Julius Caesar in 54 BC into the Roman world. We could argue that it happens independently through diplomacy, but this happens in exactly the places where Caesar campaigns. And I think that is too much of a coincidence. But let's return to Rome. Let's try and understand how these changes were reflected in Rome. And the important place to see this in is the street theatre that is the Roman triumph. Because the Roman generals, once they have achieved their success and they can claim a triumph, a victory, they display their status in a variety of ways. And one of this is by building great public monuments, and another is in the triumphal procession. Now, I've already mentioned the theatre of Pompey, which Pompey intends to celebrate his great victories across the world, and really to create a museum to his own success, and at the same time providing a theatre for the people. But Julius Caesar's also doing this. He starts building great public works at the same time. So we have mentions in the letters going to and fro between Cicero and his brother and others that he's building a great building called the Scepter, which is a place where people could vote. So this is a public place. But he also is building a new forum. And I'm going to come back to that new forum. As I try and remember, there's very conspicuous display in very lavish public buildings with very exotic materials. But in the Triumph, this is where the general, the successful general, comes to town. And it's very formulaic. The general is the focus of this. Behind him marches successful army garlanded with laurel wreaths. In front of them, in a very formulaic way, are the vanquished, and the most important vanquished walk right in front of the general, and in front of that again is all the bling, literally loads of money. And it's very ritual. Now this is a cut that actually shows a procession of Tiberius, either just before or after the turn of the millennia. And you can see the general, Tiberius here, he's in his chariot, pulled by white horses, and behind him there is a slave. And that slave's job is to hold a wreath over the successful general's head. And that successful general is playing God for the day. He's dressed up in traditional costume, and he's Jupiter. And the slave simply whispers, "Remember, you are but a man." And it's to keep that general grounded. But in front of him, the first row of treasure will be often gold rings, gold necklaces of some form, the bullion. And in Britain, the famous torques, Snettisham, you can see some of them on display in the British Museum. These are the kind of things that we can imagine being carried there. It's clear that Julius Caesar brought chariots back, because on coins we see representations of chariots, and the only time that he mentions in all the decade of fighting in Gaul is in Britain. And there are references in court poets later on to people running around in their painted British chariot. So we must imagine some of the material is displayed in chariots that are brought back. And then, in this representation of the procession from the Temple of Apollo Socianus, we have the vanquished, and they are literally put on biers and carted round in front of the successful general. And we know when Caesar celebrates his triumph, we hear of people, we hear that Juba II, who's just a child, arouses sympathy because he's so small. Cleopatra's sister, Alcinous, is there. And Vercingetorix, who leads the rebellion against Caesar in 52 BC, is there. And it's interesting how Caesar chooses to represent Britain, because he represents France, Germany, and Britain by rivers. He doesn't have people. Now, to the Romans, the rivers are gods. And so for the conquest of France, he represents the River Rhone, which was the old boundary of the province. For Germany, he represents the River Rhine. But for Britain, it's a statue, a golden statue of the sea in chains. And what Caesar is telling us, as clearly as we could possibly imagine, is that he has gone beyond the known world and he has conquered the sea. And what he's doing is the counterpoint to what Pompey has done. Now, this is an image I showed you earlier. Pompey claims to have conquered the world to all its edges. Caesar goes beyond the edge of the known world. And so the fact that he crosses the Rhine for a very short period, just a few weeks in 55 BC, and then he comes to Britain just for a few weeks in 55 BC, Caesar is deliberately making the point that he is doing what no person has done before. And almost to cap it all, the theatre of Pompey is due to be inaugurated in September 55 BC. And the news that Caesar has crossed the sea to Britain will have reached Rome in September 55 BC. It's as perfect an example of raining on somebody's parade as you could possibly imagine. And finally, let's return to Caesar's temple of Venus Genetrix. It's a temple to his family goddess. And at the end of his triumph, he makes an offering there. And it's a remarkable offering because it's British pearls. And Pliny's Natural History makes the point that Caesar wished it to be known that the cuirass, a piece of armour, is made from British pearls. They may be small and they may be discoloured compared to the wonderful ones that could come from the east, but they come from the sea. And so what he's doing in that is making the point that he is presenting the bounty of the sea. He's conquered the sea, and he's done what nobody else has done before. So, just to briefly recap that, I've argued that Caesar's conquests of Britain are not failures. They're regarded as very great triumphs in Rome at the time. But one of the consequences of the view that people thinking that Caesar's campaigns had no lasting effect is that there was no effect on Britain. But what the archaeology tells us is that we see rich burials emerging with links to Rome. We see the first towns with a very formal urban planning arriving. We see the presence of Romans there. And we have very strong links in the coinage that suggest that they are presenting a visual language of the Roman world. This could all happen by accident, but I think it's far more likely that this is a direct consequence of Caesar's invasions and the lasting links that he makes in 54 BC. Now, one of the things, many things that Caesar leaves us with is the first description of the Britons, of people painted in woad. But he also leaves us the very first geographical description of Britain. He gives precise measurements, very precise measurements. Elsewhere he refers to a great Greek geographer, Aristophanes. He tells us the size of Britain, and he makes a very odd comment. He talks about, we had a water clock. Why does he want a water clock? It's so they can measure the length of the day, and that allows them to fix the latitude of Britain. Because although the Romans don't have maps in the way that we understand them, they can calibrate distance and they can calibrate longitude and latitude. So Caesar is defining both physically, in terms of his geography, what Britain looks like. He's also telling us what the people look like in his ethnography. But in going beyond the world that Pompey claimed to have conquered, what Caesar does in his conquest of Britain is that he is redefining the known world, and he's redefining it in his own image. Thank you.